Hello everyone, this is Daniel Keys, and today I'm going to be painting Autumn Aspens in pastel. So my subject is a fun one for me. I took this photograph a few years ago on the eastern side of the Sierras here in California of an aspen grove. It was about November, October, something like that, and a lovely sunny day and this kind of intimate snapshot of this grove of aspens. So let's begin. I'm starting with a new Pastel brand. They recently sent me a sampling of their product called Earthberry. And so that these first few marks here are with one of their sticks. I would say it's sort of between Terry Ludwig and a Blue Earth, something like that. I really like them. Both of these here are that particular manufacturer, and so I wanted to test them out. And the colors that they sent are sort of earthy. They called it a floral set, but a lot of the tones seem to be kind of an earthy tone, and so I thought they were nicely suited for this scene. And I'm basically just, as I've done with all of my pastel demonstrations, I'm putting down colors that are, I'm approximating a color and value. It's a little, you kind of have to trust the process because obviously I'm going to go over this with the alcohol or some sort of liquid. You can use alcohol or Gamsol or solvent or even water. I'm going to use rubbing alcohol, but it will drastically affect the color and value when I do that. So, and the other thing it will do is it will spread the pigment around. So I'm just using a really light touch, just barely scraping the surface of this sanded paper, just to grab enough of it that I can see the color that I'm putting down, I can see the value, and approximate whether or not it's going to work. And then I put it into my little tray there on the right. And what's nice about this part of the process, it's of course a lot of fun to do because you're not going to do any really careful drawing. Any of the planning is done sort of in my head, and there's just approximate placement for large shapes, large swaths of shape, color, and value. But the other thing it kind of does is it begins to set my palette. You can see really quickly, and of course this is edited as I'm selecting colors. You're not seeing me take the time to do that. But it creates this sort of foretelling of what we're going to be using. If I put down a color and it seems appropriate, I set that aside because I'm going to pick that up again at some point in the painting process. So now I've put out some rubbing alcohol. Of course, I grabbed the nearest container to put it in, which is an antique teacup. Why not? And then just an old brush, just something that I don't mind rubbing up against sandpaper because obviously you do that enough, it's going to wear down all the bristles. So it's just an old brush I've used for oil painting or just general painting. And but I'm really saturating it with the alcohol. You can see that because it becomes very fluid with the pigment, and it just moves around almost like a watercolor. And I'll get drips and scratchy marks, all kinds of things will happen. And I allow that. I don't over mix the colors together because I don't want it to be muddy. So you'll see me go back to dipping into more of the alcohol. I'll even take my paper towel and absorb some of it just to make sure as I move from a lighter value color area to a darker one or vice versa. I don't want to have everything meet in the middle. And whether it's pastel painting or, as I more often teach, oil painting, I notice that people tend to pay less attention than they should, even in a stage like this. They start out with strong darks, strong lights, saturated color, and then they quickly lose it because they mix the two together, or they allow everything to mix together and they bring everything into the middle. And I don't want to do that. We've established some clear value pattern, and I want to preserve that. And so keeping my brush fully saturated as I go to another color, or wiping off excess pigment from the last time I swiped across the paper is essential. You saw me there take a paper towel and lift some of the pigment, and instead of putting down in the initial stage, I didn't put down any of the whites and grays, the lighter colors that will be the trunks of the trees. Instead, I am keeping the surface wet, and while it's wet, I'm wiping away or sort of absorbing the pigment while it's wet with my paper towel. That's just a dry, dirty paper towel. I've been using it to remove some of the excess on my brush as I use the alcohol, but it's absorbing enough of the pigment that I basically get the value of the paper showing through. And that will just sort of generally mark where some of the tree trunks are going to be. The looser I can make this, I feel, the better, because everything on top of this will only begin to refine it. And I'm not interested, just as I am with oil painting, I'm not interested in just covering everything up. I like various degrees of finish and layers exposed. And so in an area where I can get away with leaving some of this wash, I will. But with that in mind, I still want that area to look painted, and I want it to look interesting. So I'll make it as interesting as possible by making it as loose as possible. And that will add texture and more finish to the painting, but it's deceptive. It's unfinished. It just will add to the painting. And you can see once it fully evaporated, the alcohol fully evaporated, all of the colors came back to the lighter values that they were. And so this next stage here is what I call the block-in. I'm going to be a little more specific about where I'm placing the various tree trunks and how I design it. This is where I have in my head usually what the design is going to be after I study the subject long enough, and in this case, just looking at the photo for, days and days, just going back and forth and trying to figure out what the problems would be with the design. Nature does not give you a perfect composition. Once in a while it does, and it's wonderful. But in most cases with landscape painting, you're going to have to move things around a bit in your painting. And you're going to have to think those things through. When you're out in the field, which is what I recommend people do when they paint landscapes, when you're out in the field, you don't have as much time to do that. So you want to sort of maybe not get stuck in a rut, but develop a system where maybe you become quicker at editing something in your head as you look at it and figuring out a design. I think one of the first steps to take in doing that is establish a center of interest. What in the scene do you most want to emphasize? Is it a tree? Is it a group of trees? Is it a mountain? A stream? Whatever it is, not just what you would like to emphasize, but what would make the most sense in emphasizing. In a scene like this, I can't settle on one little leaf or one little twig. There are too many shapes in here that would make a dominant, more impactful, attention-grabbing subject. And so I want to choose from one of those. And once I've established that, I try to find a way, as I look at the scene, this one in particular, I have two pretty dominant tree trunks. There's one on the left and one on the right. And so I need to decide which I'm going to emphasize. Because having the two of them there, even though I think they're different enough, I think I could get away with leaving both in or painting them as they are. I still want to make one a little stronger, a little more dominant. And so that's what I'm saying. I want to quickly look at a scene and have some sense, some system in the background that's running that helps me make those decisions. There's no right or wrong, so that's why I say you have to be fluid. But having that just running in the background, like a computer, a system that helps me that I can kind of rely on. And so once I've determined I have something that will make a good center of interest, and in this case it's going to be the tree on the right, I then look for anything else that would grab too much attention, and I start to problem solve. How can I make that more subservient to the center of interest? How can I add it and make it less dominant, or do I need to just edit it out and omit it? And in this case, you'll see as I go through this process of the painting, I paint both, but I don't make the one on the left quite as big. And then I paint it a little looser, meaning I don't put as much detail. And eventually you're going to see the value pattern. My strongest value contrast are going to be on that right tree. So all of those decisions I have made over the course of studying this image. And like I said, just sort of every once in a while taking a look at it, getting it out and looking at it on my phone or on the computer, days before deciding to, days before actually painting this. And that helped so much to make this process go more smoothly, because I had already done so much of my problem solving. So this is still the block-in stage. You can see I'm pulling from my palette. I have added additional colors now, but I'm still going back and forth to those original colors. Those decisions in the beginning helped, because as I would put something down, it tells me, is it the right tone? Is it the right color? And also, is it going to be the right value? I'm going to add to the palette as I go, but once I've established a sort of base at the very beginning, it just makes it so easy to pull from that, and I end up with a pretty unified looking painting. Obviously, I'll add any color that I see, and I'll make adjustments, and I have lots to choose from, as most pastel painters do. But it turns out that I don't need everything that I have. Once I've established what the essentials are, and in this case, those earthy grays, greens, and orange yellows, they're all distinct color, recognizable, but they're earthy. And what I mean is the chroma is not so vibrant and so saturated. It's not a strong orange, or a lemon yellow necessarily, or really vivid magenta. There's a gray pink in there, one of the earth berries. And I see a lot of that in this scene, that kind of earthy, soft pink, pink red color. And so it turns out that I don't need as many as I think. Once I've established that palette, the palette will grow, but I still rely pretty heavily on those initial selections. Just establishing some of my darks here. The light in this instance, on this scene, is warm. I think there were some cloud cover, but it seems that some direct sun was coming through, and so you're getting warm light. But it's probably I don't know. I think it was close to midday, late morning, so it's not really intense warm light, but it is warmer. It's not an overcast day completely, so you're getting some direct light. And so the initial lights need to have some warmth to them, and I would say the initial shadows are going to have some cooler color, some bluer tones, but my darkest darks are still going to be on the warmer side. And so that dark that I have there is really just a dark brown. And I've said this in other demonstrations before, but it's worth repeating. I find as I delve more into the pastel world and spend more time with students who paint in this medium and so forth, that there's a reliance on dark purples. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for them or that they aren't useful. Sure, of course, at some point in nature, you're going to see that. But oftentimes it just becomes a crutch. And everyone I've seen, not everyone, but the vast majority, are relying really heavily on cooler blues and purples for their darkest darks. And they're really killing the overall color and temperature of their paintings, especially their landscape paintings. And so I would highly suggest, not that, any pastel artist I've met, certainly don't need more pastels. It's such an addictive thing, and I'm talking from experience. But I have spent quite a bit of time searching out more dark browns and reds, and it's paid off. It's been so helpful. I have a good amount of from all kinds of brands of pastel manufacturers of dark browns and reds, and they have proven very useful. So for my darkest darks, and I won't get into the how light temperature works. Maybe I'll make a separate video for that. But just suffice it to say that in a case like this, you've got warm light, and as I said, initially, as an object turns from that light, it gets cooler in appearance. But the absence of light, the darkest darks, it's almost like the darker shadows within a initially shadowed area are going to revert back to a warmer tone. It doesn't mean that they're hot, that they're orange and bright or anything like that. It's dark, but it's not going bluer. It maintains a certain warmth, and if you'll make that adjustment in your landscape paintings, I guarantee they'll improve. So just try it and do it for a while, and then as you go out, try to look for it and see if you see that it's true, and it'll make a significant difference in your paintings. So this is a unison that I have, and sort of a soft gray. It's slightly cooler. It's not blue, but it does have a bluish tone to it. And so I'm going back and forth with my grays. I've got some that are kind of a dusty blue color and some that are a little warmer. I don't want to go overly blue. There's a temptation to do that. I say that as I pick up a blue pastel stick. But it's sort of a mixture. I'll go back and forth between warmer grays and bluer grays until I get the right tone. One of the problem-solving issues in this particular scene, that blue that you see in the background, especially there on the upper right area, is actually a river. And so that was the reflection of water, and it's sort of in shadow from the trees, and it's just reflecting the blue of the sky. And so I had to decide what to do about that because I don't think it will come across as water. There's just not enough information. But I did like that color in there. And so what I thought would be a solution is just to make it more trees, but allow some of that color to be in there because certainly some of those shadows could be on the bluer side, maybe not that blue, but you'll see that with warm light. You'll see some blue shadows, especially on a white object like these aspen tree trunks. So I think it works. I don't go as blue or I don't let it sort of dominate, but I think it's just a nice note of color. I think it added a lot to this scene overall, and the color harmony, just adding a tiny bit of contrast to it. And so I've decided to put it in, but not the other thing you could do is to add more information so that it sort of becomes more obvious that it is water. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't feel like that would be as successful a decision, and this just made more sense to me. This pastel stick, which is being used to paint the white, notice when I put it in the tray and you can really see what color it is, it's like a yellow gray. It's a light gray with quite a bit of yellow in it, but it looks like a white tree trunk. And so I was alluding to that earlier, just paying attention to the temperature of the light. It being warm, that means the lightest things, the lightest values, or any area that is in the light are going to have at least a little bit of warmth to them. And so I think because white is a colder color, when we look at something white, we assume it's cool. But knowing that there was warm sunlight, it helped for me to, as I was making decisions of what pigments to use, and it's surprising, but it works. How much yellow I could actually put into those tree trunks, and they still look white. At this point, I'm not doing very much blending. You'll see me sort of tap my finger a bit here and there, but I'm still blocking in. I'm still sort of just developing things, and so I have my pencils handy just to clean up some edges. Because this is my focal tree, I'm being very aware of making sure it is the most developed. But for the most part, the rest of the painting, I'm still just blocking in. I'm adding marks here and there, and I'm getting just enough pigment on the paper in some areas to be able to rub it, to be able to blend a bit. But I certainly want to do more of that, and I'll have to put more pigment down in order to do that, because it is a sanded surface. You can't do it right away. You could pick up a tool like a brush or a sponge or something, but I notice with a brush it really removes a lot of pigment, and so I very rarely I just don't have enough experience yet to do that. And so my process at this point is just to make sure there is enough pigment on the surface that I can swipe my fingers across it and it not sand them down, and just get, the edges that I want. But I kind of like that I can't do that too soon, because it ensures that I don't overblend. And whether it's pastel or oil painting, I try to avoid that. I see that sometimes in various paintings, and I feel it would be stronger, if I'm looking at someone's work and has good color, good drawing, good values, but it's a little overworked, or they could have ended up with a much more interesting painting if they just wouldn't have blended so much. It mixed too many pigments together. It dulls their color. It starts to look blurry and just kind of contrived. And one of the wonderful things about pastel painting is I think it's just expected to have some of these looser marks, in general. I mean, some do paint very tightly, but in this kind of painting, especially if you go out plein air painting, you end up with a faster, looser, more painterly look. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about pastels. Some of it is just because the shape of the pastel sticks themselves, they're kind of bulky and almost clumsy, in how you put it down. But it turns out beautifully if you layer that and you contrast it with softer, more refined areas. It turns out to be a much more interesting look, I feel. So this little piece I have, obviously it was bigger at one point. It's sort of an ochre color. I talked earlier about my quest for getting all the right dark browns. And one of my other obsessions is finding ochre colors. In oil paint, I use Yellow Ochre Pale by Winsor & Newton. And it's just a favorite staple for me on my palette. I'm constantly using it. And in pastel, I'm just ever searching for just the right shade of ochre. And I find that it's really not, there is no perfect shade, and it's not that any of them are imperfect, but rather just having a variety of colors within that range of an earthy yellow, basically. And so I use that quite a bit, and it's such an essential color to me in landscape painting. It's obviously a temptation to get these bright greens and blues and yellows, and I want those too, but there's something about ochre that just, you can put it in almost any landscape calls for it somewhere. And so I'm ever adding those colors within that range to my palette. I always say this is the point in the painting where I'm telling myself, trust the process, because it sort of goes through the stage early on with the initial wash that it's exciting, it's fast, it's abstract. And it's still abstract, but it's sort of in between at this point where, okay, you've put down some serious marks, some things that are going to show no matter how developed this painting becomes. But there's not enough to carry the painting. It looks a little crude. And I usually in my head, I'm trying to silence the voices that are screaming, "This isn't working. This doesn't look good. It looks amateur," and just I have to trust the process. Eventually, enough will come on, enough will be put onto the surface that it all starts to make sense. But I just sort of keep my head down, figuratively, and keep going. However, I put in a great deal of thought into these decisions that I'm making. So as I'm working here in this area that's going to be very abstract, all these branches and leaves and tree trunks are sort of they're tangled up, intertwined together. I have to apply color and make marks to indicate that without overly explaining it. I'm not trying to make more sense of an area that is just naturally as abstract as this is, if that makes sense. I have areas where there's larger shapes that will be refined, like the main tree trunk, where the eye can rest as far as the design goes. Your eye goes to that, and it will continue to go back to it. And so I don't want to make sense of chaos if an area looks chaotic. I want to intimate that chaos. And so I'm trying to find ways to indicate that. And so when I say I'm trusting the process, I keep my head down and just keep going, I'm not putting less thought as I go. I am putting as much thought, equal or more, as I go, as I make decisions moving forward, as I did at the very beginning. I move fast, I apply things quickly, but make no mistake about it, I'm putting a great deal of thought into each area of this. That's a beautiful, warm brown, sort of a leathery, brown. It's like it has warmth, but it has green in it. Just kind of I'm not even sure what I would say. It's just like a ochre-y, rusty kind of color. Probably a blue earth. I think that one's a blue earth. Lots of designing in this painting, and that's why I'm talking so much about it. As I move along, I'm making decisions about how I want to design each tree or a group of trees. And so I'm using the photo as my reference. Obviously, I'm pulling from that the essential information, but I'm not putting in every branch, and I'm not putting every branch or twig in the spot I see it. I'm moving things around. I'm trying to if I could explain it this way, I'm trying to combine what I'm seeing in the scene with the reference here, or if I were out in the field, trying to take in the information and also let the painting, I know this sounds really kind of new agey, and I don't mean it this way, but for lack of better words, letting the painting speak to me. Not that I'm actually hearing voices or anything like that, but you know what I mean. I'm trying to assess what the painting needs. And that requires me to not just look at my reference, or not just look at the scene or the model or whatever I'm painting, but for it to be a real work of art, I want to see and assess what I feel it needs to look the way I think it should look or the way that I want it to look. In the end, this ends up as a painting, hopefully on someone's wall or my wall or a gallery wall. And people aren't looking at the reference. They're not looking at the actual scene. They're just looking at your painting. And so you might have been true to life and followed every little branch, every little leaf that was there in reality. But it doesn't mean that turned out a better painting, in my opinion. And so the further into a painting I go, as far as the process, making my way to the finish, the less I'm looking at just the reference and the more I'm looking at the painting and deciding and assessing, what does it need? What would make the most sense? What would be the most beautiful or the most interesting? In some cases, the most whimsical or unexpected, a combination of those things. And in the early days of my development, I that was not even a thought. But more and more as I go along, and I've been painting now for over 20 years. These days, I'm doing that more often. I'm looking at the painting, especially as I reach the end of that process. As I near the end of a painting, I'm looking more at the painting than I am at the subject. And when you're developing, when you're trying to improve, you should be doing less of that. You should be looking at the subject and getting the drawing right, getting the values, trying to perceive and replicate the color. But as you develop, you reach a stage where, okay, you're confident, I can get that color, I can get that value. Now I want it to be art, and that requires me to look at the painting and see, just sort of, like I said, for lack of better words, let it speak to me. What does it need? What would make it the most beautiful or the most interesting? This foreground that I go back and forth with between the tree trunks and the sort of sage shrubs and grasses in the foreground, I'm basically just pulling from the colors that I see in the photo reference. You can go back to a fuller image because it's cropped here. I wanted to emphasize the palette. That foreground, I basically just pull the colors that you're seeing even in the small area of it that you can in the photo reference, and I'm just designing it myself. So basically that means I'm making it up. I'm using the materials that are there to make it up, because there just wasn't a lot of information, there wasn't a lot of value change. There was basically all of this foliage, all of this grass and sage mixed together, and not a lot of value contrast. So I like that large area. I like the design and having the trees, start above the halfway mark on the painting, because I think as a design it's interesting. But that also, presented a problem to be solved, which was how can I make the foreground interesting while maintaining the trees as my focal point or my center of interest. And so as I develop that, I'm just basically, I'll be adding the same colors that I started with, but sort of putting smaller shapes, layering, building that up to make it interesting and painted and painterly, but not distracting. More of that dark red ochre kind of color going in between some of these tree trunks. One of the techniques I'm using is I'm not making a solid line outlining the tree trunk. So you see there, I'll put a mark, let's say in between the two, any two tree trunks. I won't make a solid mark in between them, a solid vertical line. What you see me do is sort of a series of marks, and each one may be a little wider or a little narrower, so it's not uniform. And what that's doing is instead of defining a perfect, trying to get a perfect vertical trunk, it makes it, it abstracts it a bit. It makes it as though there's branches and twigs and debris in between. So it basically softens those lines. And it gives enough definition that you start to see a tree trunk, but not so perfectly outlined that it looks isolated. Instead, it sort of starts in areas, it blends in with the background. There's lots of layers. Like I said, there's just lots of debris. And so it's not perfectly isolated, perfectly outlined. And by doing a series of marks going up and down a tree trunk on either side, I give that impression. And so it's, again, that's a way of problem solving. How can I paint this, but it look the way it looks in that photo or the way it looks in real life? And that's one of the ways that I address that. I've also sort of blended a bit by swiping my hand back and forth, but by not doing a solid line outlining these trunks, it just looks more convincing. That's my a Giraud pastel stick. I do like having them handy because when I do need a little more control, because they're they're so narrow of a stick, it really allows for almost like drawing, finer detail. Even though I'm using it loosely, I do feel I have a bit more control with it. Some of these chunkier pastel sticks, it's hard to even call them sticks. They're almost cubes, and so when you go to lay something down, you're not quite sure where it's going to land. But the Giraud, I have a narrower margin, so it kind of it makes it just a little easier to control. I've noticed with the Aspens, one of the most interesting aspects of them, besides, of course, the light value white bark of the trunks, are the branches, which kind of they seem to grow in all kinds of directions. I'm not super familiar with the growing pattern of the trees, but some of them twist, and obviously they get those knots where previously branches were, and those are those darker spots. And so the branches sort of range in value. Obviously, some of them maintain that white bark throughout, and so they catch more light. But they, in other places, either become dark or they are dark. Like I said, I'm not all too familiar with the actual growing pattern, but I like the variety. And so I'm adding dark, narrow branches here as I come up to the top. And I'm trying to still continue with the design. I don't want them all going the same direction. I really try, in good design, I try to avoid too much predictability. When things become too uniform, too predictable, where you can almost count on if there's a branch in one spot, there's a counter branch on the other side, and it becomes uniform and symmetrical. It, to me, reads as unnatural. And in nature, there's far less predictability. There are patterns, but there's a wide range of variety within that pattern. And so it creates a randomness. And even if I see too much symmetry in the actual setup or on site, I rely on that knowledge that I have from previous painting experiences dealing with nature being so random, and I'll sort of push that, or I'll use that to my advantage and design something that seems less predictable. I stated earlier at the very beginning of this demonstration how the palette has grown, or how it would grow, and yet maintain this sort of limited harmony, basically where there's a dominant. It's mostly an ochre-y yellow. I mean, if you were going to, of the three primaries, categorize this painting, just having red, yellow, and blue, obviously all three are incorporated, it's dominant yellow. And you can see that reflected in the palette, where even the blues are not necessarily warm, but they're duller, or they're a little kind of a dusty blue. And the greens, they're a yellow green, yellow gray green. There's just a lot of yellow, and not highly chromatic apart from a few of the leaves, but mostly, like I said, an ochre earth tone kind of yellow. And I love seeing the palette develop like that. The darks have yellow in them. They're brown. This sort of dark violet, purple, red, purple that I'm using here, it's leaning brown. And so it's not just red or blue. It would have red, yellow, and blue in it to make it that sort of warm, desaturated, kind of grayed down maroon color. And I should say, I think I mentioned earlier, and you can see it there on the palette, it's sort of I keep saying dusty pink, but it's a warm, faded looking pink color. And I notice with autumn, I'll see that mixed in with the oranges and the yellows. There's often this underlying pink, gray pink color. You'll see that in the springtime as well. This part here is a bit of an experiment. So I'm always trying to problem solve, and that requires getting out of my comfort zone and trying new things and experimenting just to see if it will work. So what I've done here is I've got that rubbing alcohol out again, just I never emptied it out of that cup. And I've dipped a part of my paper towel in it, and I want to just sort of see if I can build up a sense of texture. Obviously, this is going to be a primarily flat surface. There's not any real texture on it, but I want to mimic the look of it. And so I took my paper towel and I kind of rolled it around, and that alcohol, where it touches, I've kind of creased that paper towel, and where it touches the surface, it sets that pigment and it removes it in other places. So it will create, I'm not sure what I would call it. Some of it will look like striations. Some of it will mostly just look like random pattern, and sort of give a sense of there being texture. If it were oil paint, obviously you would build up actual literal texture using paint and brushes and getting various layers on the surface. In pastel, I just, similarly, if I were painting watercolor, I'm going to mimic that because I can't really build up the pigment too much, but I can create a sort of a sense of it. Adding a bit more of a blue, sort of a violet gray blue to some of these trunks. And another color that I see pop up throughout them are these kind of gray greens. And that's what's so wonderful about spending time with a subject. Initially, you think, oh, they're white with some black spots where maybe branches were, but there's kind of underlying tones, yellows and greens, and of course blues and purples in the shadows. So you get a variety. It's all harmonious because they're all just slightly off of white or slightly off of kind of a gray color, but they'll lean a certain way. They'll lean more blue or more green, yellow, red, whatever. And I notice with these, I can add a lot of green tones, and combined with the purple blues, it makes for a vibrant sea. Even though it's not vibrant, it's not garish and highly chromatic, it sort of vibrates, having these tones next to each other and not mixing them or covering one up with the other, but rather letting them play side by side. And what I did just there, and I'm continuing to do, I'm using the broad side of the pastel stick, and I'm adding color, but I'm also, I would say, maybe even more so in a case like this, I'm pushing some of the pigment around. So I'm taking the broad side of a pastel stick, dragging it across where I want to soften, but not overly blend. And because I said earlier about just that overworking something, overblending an area, it doesn't, I just don't like the look of it. I don't feel it lends well to the overall finish of a painting. And oftentimes it just mixes too many things together. It becomes sort of a muddy, blurry area. But again, this is the result of problem solving. How do I blend without causing that muddiness or causing that overworked look? And so one of the things I've come up with, and I'm sure others do too, is I take the broad side of that, a pastel stick, and I'll drag it through, not pressing down so firmly that I'm covering everything, but just enough that I'm adding in places where it sort of catches, but I'm also dragging the pigment there that's underneath, and I get a loose, just subtle blending without any sort of overworking. Adding some leaves here. There aren't many in this scene. Obviously, this is later in the season. Many of the leaves have fallen, but quintessential aspen, they're so known for those rounded sort of silver dollar shaped leaves. And so I'm adding a few where I don't necessarily see them. Again, as I get this far into a painting, I'm not just looking at the reference any longer. I'm pulling from that reference information like color and value, but I'm making choices based on what I feel the painting needs to be as strong as it can be, as beautiful or as interesting, whatever word suits you, but basically to turn it into what I think is a successful painting. And those are decisions that are going to be unique to you. I try to walk people through what my thought process is, but even that, it's limited. And I want to say all of that with sort of the proverbial grain of salt, that it's just the way that I would do it, or it's the choices that I would make. It doesn't make them right or wrong innately. It's the artist part, it's the creative part. How do I see this? How am I interpreting it? And what would I like to see it become? And so your answers will be different. And I think that's a good thing. So where the overall color, drawing values, those sort of fundamentals go, we can look at our subject and determine what they are and be right or wrong. But as far as the choices that we make beyond that, the design, the editing, even what we omit, all of those become the personal choices. And so that's what elevates it beyond just documenting a scene or replicating what we're seeing, and rather interpreting it and putting our spin on it, sort of painting the world the way that we want to see it or the way that we experience it. And I think that's where the individual personality of the artist comes out. And so I'm paying more attention to those things as I develop, not just in my personal career, but even with each painting. It's something that I start to lean into as the painting develops. So continuing with that, adding more branches, I do rely on these Giroux, as I mentioned earlier, because they're so narrow. I do get, it's almost one step off of, using the pencils, which I'll pull out throughout the rest of this painting. But it gives me the chance to put in some narrower marks without having to kind of look for a sharp edge on a larger stick. I haven't added much more to the palette, which I don't often get to do. Sometimes in a still life or a floral where you have a lot of variety in color, I end up with a whole pile, almost filling up that tray. In this case, it's a much more limited palette, and so it's fun to do that. It's efficient, but it also creates this wonderful harmony, almost being limited in the number of colors that I'm pulling from. And it really shows what you can do with a limited palette as well. You don't necessarily have to have everything. As I work towards the left side where I am now, I'm being cautious. I'm aware of the fact that if I overdo this, I'll detract from the central focal area, which is that large tree on the right. And so everything that leads away from that becomes less defined. Even the branches that I'm adding, they're a little looser in that they're almost kind of crude looking. They're not overly defined or refined. I want the majority of any sense of development and refinement to be in this area here, in the focal area. And so I'll spend more time there, or at least I want it to look like I spent the most amount of time there. And so I'm going to have sharper edges there. I'm going to have more nuance even. And as you can see, there's just a greater value contrast in that area. I see the darks repeated, actually. When I look at the photo, I see the darkest darks repeated in several places throughout the in between the tree trunks, but I'm not repeating that value everywhere. And if I were, I think it would still look successful, but it would not be as strong a design. It wouldn't be as dynamic, in my opinion. And so I've reserved that value contrast just for this area. Now, that dark is repeated lower down in the foreground, but it's not the same value contrast in that I have the dark there, but I don't have it next to one of the lightest lights. You see where that tree trunk is, the darkest darks are right next to and crashing against the lightest lights, creating that impactful value contrast. That dark repeated in other places, like the foreground, it's almost a gradient. it gets that dark, but it's not right next to a light. And so it's a subtle shift rather than sort of a clashing of values. I feel like I've learned a lot from doing this particular painting. I love when a painting sort of has that breakthrough element because I know these things, but doing them or having a subject that really helps me put that to the test. I can sort of now have experience in the thing that I know theoretically, and now I can sort of incorporate that into future paintings, not even just landscapes, but maybe still lifes and florals, and seeing what would happen if I follow the same pattern, keeping the just sort of keeping tabs on the values and maybe omitting some of the darks in places that aren't my center of interest, limiting the highest value contrast to just one area, even if I do see it repeated in real life, making the choice to omit it in places that I don't want to call a great deal of attention to, just to create maybe a stronger sense of the design or the value pattern. At this point, I'm not even looking at the photo reference anymore. I'm just looking at the painting, and I'm looking for areas to maybe develop a little further, add a little more definition, but very carefully, very cautiously. You see I loosen some of the edges there. I put the color down, but then again with the broad side, just sort of drag it really quickly across, sort of building some of the color and the variety of color and value, but then softening it so that it's not stark or high contrast. And it incorporates, to counter what I was saying earlier, or to balance it out a little bit, I'm not opposed to blending. I'm just very cautious about it, and I want it to be on purpose. At the same time, I don't want everything sharp. So the opposite is, and I've seen this in work too, where nothing is blended. Everything just sort of stands alone. Every mark is just put down and left alone, never modified, which is fine if it worked when you put it down. But so oftentimes, whether it's pastel or oil, it needs to be modified. And one of the words I like to use to describe it is incorporating. I try to incorporate it. I want things to relate to each other. I do want some mixing to happen. I don't want everything to look just like a separate puzzle piece, and I just put them all side by side. I want them to interact with each other. And so that does require some mixing, some blending, or some form of it. I just am very deliberate as I do it. I don't do it just out of habit, not thinking. I want it to be on purpose, and so thought has to go into doing it. I would recommend sort of paying attention to yourself as you work, because we can all of us, we can do things habitually, not because it's needed, not because there's a lot of thought, but because it's our habit to do so. And I see that with things like blending, where someone is just, they modify everything they put down just because that's what they do. They're not necessarily doing that because that's what that mark or brushstroke, whatever you're doing, needed. I don't want to do something just because it's the habit. I sort of thoughtlessly do it every time I put something down. I want to assess, what does this mark need? What does this brush stroke need? And sometimes it needs blending, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it needs another color on top of it. Sometimes it's dragging something over, or whatever methods or means you have of accomplishing something. But be aware of what you're doing. Be watchful of yourself. I know it's a lot to do. You're looking at the subject, plus you're looking at the painting. You're trying to remember all of these things, but at some point, take inventory of what you do as you're doing it, and assess: is it because that's what it needed, or is it just because, well, it's a habit, it's thoughtless, you didn't even know you were doing it because you weren't aware. I don't want to. We all fall prey to that, and I try to counter it. I try to be mindful of it so that I'm not just moving my hand around, or the stick or the brush around mindlessly. Developing this foreground. As I said, you can go back to the beginning and look at the entire reference photo. There's not a lot more information there, and I am mostly just pulling from the colors and the values that are, some of them that are there, and then sort of designing this freeform myself. I like having it darker as I go down, and you notice that does help bring the eye up to that center of interest. If I have too much light and value contrast going on down here, it's going to detract from that, but I can put little notes of it. And so you see I'm using, these are all these smaller rectangles here, like the one I have in my hand and others in the palette tray. They're Blue Earth. I think it's the warm green set. It's a wonderful, beautiful set, and this is probably the first time I've used it, the first painting I've pulled it out for. And they're great. I like Blue Earth because it has the value, all the values of a color range. And this is mostly warm greens, and then as they get lighter, to one side it's warmer, to the other it's cooler, but it also gets lighter. And so you get these really beautiful gray greens. And I find them useful in this painting because of all the sage that's growing amidst the grasses and the other shrubs. And that sage is kind of a almost a deceptive color because it's so much cooler than the grass, but it's not blue. It's bluer, just not totally blue. So it's green and this sort of light, warm gray green. And so I'm just putting little shapes and larger shapes. I want a variety. There's not a lot of information in a mass like this. And so it really is dependent on mimicking the look of texture. Like I said, if it were an oil painting, it would just be a matter of getting a brush out, building up the paint. In this case, I have to mimic that. And so little bits of color and value change amidst the larger, sort of broader strokes, getting a variety of sizes in the mark making, adds the sense of all of this texture without actually adding much of it. I like unexpected color in a mass like this. So this is that kind of soft, peachy color that was used, I think, in some other places. But I've matched the value to some of those greens and yellows, only I've shifted, with the peach, it has more red in it. And so just a few dots of colors like that are unexpected. They add a lot of variety, but I do see it in the reference photo. And you'd be amazed what you can get away with. I can add all kinds of color to something like this just in small doses. And as long as the value is right, and maybe the temperature isn't too far off from the larger mass, it you can get away with all kinds of color, and it adds a lot of visual interest. Some of that dusty pink color again. See, it's completely different than the greens as far as the tone, but because the value and the temperature work together, they're not that far off. It adds a lot. It tones down some of the green, makes it a little more brown as they mix together. Again, using the broad side of that stick to kind of soften in areas without over blending or mixing. It's a beautiful addition. I love that mixture. Just little dabs of color. And now getting out my pencils. And I've used them here and there throughout, but just to get a slightly sharper edge in some areas and to add little bits of detail. There's a ton of the dark spots on these trees. Some of them are just almost covered in dark. I don't necessarily add each one. I like the white kind of dominant, but these little bits of dark are kind of a tell with aspen trees. It's sort of unique to them. They have these dark spots on them. So you have to have at least some on your tree trunks. I do a lot of pushing with the pencil, and I don't know if that comes through visually, but you can kind of see it with the tree branch because there's pigment already on the surface. To push some of that out of the way and get a good mark with the pencil, sometimes I'll push it away from myself or away from my hand, and to get a cleaner sort of mark like that. Just sort of pushing it along the edge of those branches gives me a little bit more definition. Again, warm brown. Look at how impactful that is on that white, the base of that white tree trunk. It warmed it, darkened it, softened it, did so much just in that one little area. Not a solid line outlining the edge. I talked about that earlier, breaking it up, and how much more accurate that looks. If I were to make it a solid outline, I think it becomes cartoonish. In reality, edges sort of are found and lost, on the same plane. And so by sort of starting and stopping a line, whether with the pencil or with the pastel stick, it's far more effective, and you can see it throughout this painting. And at the end, when you see the detail shots and the up close shots, I would recommend you look for that. There's not a solid outline. It's that start and stop, start and stop. hopefully you can see the value of brown. I know that sounds funny, but especially with landscapes, but not limited only to landscapes, but just how necessary shades of brown are. If you've got a lot of purples and blues, dark blues in your palettes that you're relying on for your darks, I cannot recommend enough investing in some dark browns and just various shades of brown. There's so much brown in nature, and I think it's overlooked, and it's not as appreciated as it should be. Beautiful. There you have it. Obviously, I can get much clearer images with the photos, but take some time and look at these, study some of the details, and I hope you're inspired to, first of all, invest in some browns and incorporate them into your next landscape. Thanks for watching.